All right, y'all. So I just want to talk a little bit about the model that I've put together that is based off of Pat Davidson, Bill Hartman, and Evan Pycon's training models as I see them. So this first portion here, basic movement categories, qualitative and quantitative measures, and then principles progression. So essentially verbatim from Pat's book, Rethinking the Big Patterns. So to start us off, just talking a little bit about it, our starting place, then our end goal with principles progression. I would start individuals in more of a static stance, moving to more of an eccentric type activity and then a dynamic activity. So easy enough would kind of be like a wall sit, moving into a reverse lunge, moving into a forward walking lunge. Below that, we have sagittal plane, progressing to frontal plane activities, then progressing to your transverse plane activities. So sagittal plane, kind of your front to back, your gravity resistors, keeps you from falling forward, keeps you from falling backwards. So you can kind of think hamstrings and abs here. This would be your squat, bench, deadlift. Your frontal plane activity allows you to have accommodating joint actions to leverage the musculature to allow you to center your gravity over one side of your body or stance leg. And then your transverse activity would be anything rotational, so I think of coiling in and coiling out of yourself. Below that, we have our stances. So bilateral stance, then we have our unilateral front to back, progressing towards a unilateral staggered laterally stance. So your bilateral stance, again, think squat, bench, deadlift, so even stance, even grip kind of activities. Your front to back movers, hamstrings and abs. Your unilateral front to back is going to be more of a frontal plane type activity. So you think split stance, this is going to be like glute med, adductors, that sort of jazz. And then after that, we have our staggered laterally. So this would kind of be like a side lunge or a quick change in direction, anything that requires you kind of moving in that transverse plane more so. Below that, we have gravity management. So starting from a low gravity management perspective, moving towards a high gravity management. So your low gravity would be most of you in contact with the ground. So there's less of you that you have to organize against gravity. So 90-90 hip lift would kind of fall right in line with our static, our sagittal, our bilateral stance, and low gravity management. We would progress that towards high gravity management, which just means you're basically upright. So more of you have to organize against gravity. The middle ground would kind of be like a tall kneeling or kneeling stance there. Below that, we have competent range of motion. And the goal there is we are closing the gap between our passive and active range of motion. So just building competency throughout your movement categories. So am I competent with hamstrings and abs in a static, sagittal, bilateral stance with low gravity management, i.e. your 90-90 hip lift? Really good example there. Most people should be able to leverage their hamstrings in that position. And then just kind of closing the gap. So one thing you can do there is just progress some of the higher up starting places. So moving towards eccentric loading or frontal plane activities or unilateral type activities. And can you still manage the similar musculature from a sagittal perspective, progressing towards a frontal plane type perspective? So just competency with how your movement looks, with what you are feeling during that movement. Below that, we have proximal moving towards distal. So I'm going to be more successful with everything above if I'm able to start with whatever movement I'm doing with the center of gravity closest to the body. So something kind of like in CrossFit, we have a hollow hold, or in gymnastics, very similar. So low back's flat on the ground, and the goal is to end with arms and legs straight out with only low back touching. So a good starting place would be basically in a cannonball with your back flat, and then you can extend one limb at a time or two limbs and progress from there. So I'm starting closer to my body, progressing further away from my body. Below that, we have a high reactive reference building towards low reactive reference. So what immediately comes to mind is kind of like a band around the knees for certain scenarios and circumstances. Similarly, sometimes in a 90-90, I'll have people put a band around their back so it incites them to reach. So anything that kind of provides counter feedback for you to push against. So somebody pushes you, you push back into them. Below that, we have a high contact reference moving to a low contact reference. So your high contact, again, 90-90 hip lift's a really good example here. Most of you is in contact with something, so it just makes it much easier to organize the body. You can kind of feel your mass on the floor and how to organize so things are more flush or even, whatever that means to you. And then progressing towards a low contact reference, this may be as simple as a single leg deadlift with your back foot against the wall. So it is in contact, again, forcing you to organize in a specific way to achieve the movement. Below that, we have lots of constraints progressing towards fewer constraints. So this is how I can constrain the client so that they have to stay within the bowling lane to accomplish the task. So something that comes to mind here, sometimes in class, I will have a foam roller up against the wall, and they just need to pin the foam roller with their knee to the wall. So the foam roller is not necessarily pushing back or applying a reactive force, and it is somewhat of a contact reference for them, but basically they are constrained to do this movement without dropping the foam rollers. So that is their constraint. Machines are also a very good example here. So if you're in a Globo Gym type setting, all the machines are a pre-guided path, so you are constrained to move through those directions. And then lastly, we have a low training frequency building to a high training frequency. So with all these activities, regardless of low level, high level, whatever you're at, the goal in training is to start at a minimum effective dose, building to a maximal recoverable dose, and knowing how to utilize that throughout your list of movement categories or principles of progressions. So that covers the principles of progressions. Next, we have our qualitative and quantitative measures. So depending on your event or your goal in mind, we want to be able to spend as much time as possible in those race pace or intended goal settings. So from a qualitative field, we can look at our principles of progression, and we can use that as kind of our competency chart. Are you able to actually perform the movement pattern with dominant joint actions required? So are the hips, hamstrings, and abs the things actually doing the moving for your deadlift? Are you able to provide an appropriate stance or center of gravity? So this would be easier noted on your frontal plane activities. Can I actually catch adductors and glute med on the stance leg that I'm standing on? And then your planes of motion associated with appropriate muscles within that position. So once again, can I move through my frontal plane with a unilateral front to back stance and know what joint actions should be leveraging those muscles? So for a front foot elevated split squat, probably going to be more of a knee dominant type activity. So am I actually feeling quads and hamstrings and glutes throughout the motion, and a little bit of adductors and glute med to keep me centered over the stance leg. So beyond the qualitative field, we have our quantitative measures, easy enough. So we have low load, moderate load, and high load activities with the given percentages. We have short duration, moderate duration, and long duration type activities. And then we have low velocity, moderate velocity, and high velocity as pertains to weightlifting. If we were looking at something like sprinting or rowing or other type activities of the sort, we may want the high load or high intense effort to be closer to actual race pace or PR pace type activities. And then our list of movement patterns. This essentially just gives us a categorization towards your movements that you see in the gym. So to preface, unless we have these things kind of identified as this is the dominant joint doing the action, and these are the muscles that are leveraged by that joint moving away and towards center of gravity, then we're much more appropriate at building a taxonomy or, again, categories for all of our exercises within the gym, and just allows us for better and more appropriate tracking so we know where we're spending most of our time under what movement categories, so we can better organize this muscle had this many sets this week, and that'll be part of my progressive overload plan. So until you can categorize these things and know what joint and what muscles are most under leverage under what circumstances, then it's just imaginary, and your squat might as well be a deadlift with a bar on your back, or who knows what's happening. So the least amount of hodgepodge soup we can get out of this, the more accurate we can be about our training. So your hip dominant activities, you can just assume the hip is the thing moving furthest away from your center of gravity. Thus, the muscles connecting to the hip are going to have the most amount of leverage. Deadlift, single leg deadlift would be an easy bilateral or unilateral example here. Knee dominant activities, the knee is the joint moving furthest away from center of gravity, so I know the accommodating musculature that should be supporting my body and the accommodating musculature that should be doing the moving of the body. Below that, we have our horizontal push-pull, vertical push-pull, triple extension, thorax diaphragm control, pelvic diaphragm control, throwing, locomotion, and change of direction, with potential associated examples to the sides of those. So more or less, this allows me to better track the quantitative actions that are actually taking place. So how much of our volume is actually spent at a low, moderate, high load, how much of our volume of training is spent at what duration and at what velocities. So this allows me to know how much of our sets we are getting week to week. So if I'm building from 10 sets of a knee dominant activity because I'm in a squat program to up to 20 to 30 sets over 4 to 6 weeks, it is much easier to track since I know my principles of progression that allow me to be appropriate about the movement categories, so I know I'm being competent with the joint actions and the musculature that is being leveraged during those activities. So this is kind of the overall model that just allows for accurate tracking of your training. So that would be Pat Davidson's Rethinking the Big Patterns as I can best see or utilize it for my own training model.
Goodbye.